following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This week, we're talking about heuristics. No, I didn't just sneeze. A heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows us to make decisions quickly, but also risks occasionally sending us off course. We all use heuristics. If we didn't, we'd be in a constant state of cognitive overload. One of the men who coined the term heuristics in 1974 died recently. Rest in peace, Daniel Kahneman. I've got a great guest later on the show to talk to you about how understanding heuristics can help you get more comfortable trying new things. Neuroscientist Matt Johnson, author of Blindsight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brains, will be talking to us later about that. As usual, though, I set things up. Questions, comments, concerns, I know you're going to have them on this episode. Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Or you can go to the website, nottherapyshow.com, if you don't know how to spell my first name. Or join our mailing list when you're on our website. Fill out the contact form. Or social media at Not Therapy Show on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. The late Daniel Kahneman and his co-author, Amos Tversky, identified 3 types of main heuristics back in the 70s. The availability heuristic, the representativeness heuristic, and the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. An availability heuristic is a judgment of frequency or probability based on the ease with which instances or occurrences can be brought to mind. What does that mean in practice? You probably have a friend or relative who spends a lot of time on social media and is absolutely convinced that a very unlikely event, such as women getting assaulted in a public bathroom, is an absolute epidemic. A term for this is mean world syndrome. Back in the day, a lot of people thought Islamist terrorists were the biggest threat post 9/11 when white supremacists were still killing more people. If you watched the news a few summers back, you'd swear Black Lives Matter protests were plagued by violence, but over 96% of them were completely peaceful. Because the images of 9/11 and Wendy's franchises on fire during that summer were so memorable and widely distributed, these are the first things that come to mind when we think about terrorism or violent protest, but they're not the worst or most common overall. This doesn't mean availability heuristics are all bad. No heuristic is all bad. We all do them. If you're trying to choose a brand of paper towel at the store, choosing based on the last commercial you saw makes the decision quicker with really no ill effects. In fact, just mentioning paper towel might have made some of you think Bounty, the quicker picker-upper, because of its catchy slogan. That's how effective advertising works. Availability heuristics also lead to superstitions, though, also called illusory correlations. Growing up in my family, there was a superstition that killing a spider would make it rain. Breaking a mirror, giving you bad luck is in a similar category. This kind of thinking leads to things like lucky jerseys for sports teams, much to my nose's chagrin during hockey season at my old high school. But it also led to the myths about video games causing violence and sexism, just to name some things. The next type of heuristic is the representativeness heuristic. A representativeness heuristic, man, saying that one is tough, is a judgment based on the similarity of a thing to its archetype. And again, these are very technical terms, so I'm going to give you examples. Representativeness heuristics are used positively, say, spotting poison ivy when you're out for a hike, or avoiding skunks on garbage night. You see anything remotely like the bad juju, you avoid it just to be safe. Representativeness heuristics are also the core of the joke of the Pepe Le Pew cartoons, where he mistakes a black cat for another skunk. Pepe Le Pew is a victim of an illusion of validity. He's so certain that this fuzzy black lady with a white stripe down her back is a skunk, not a cat. so certain that humorous sexual harassment ensues. When it comes to people instead of cartoon cats and skunks, though, representativeness heuristics can lead to stereotypes. And we know stereotypes are bad, but let's face it, we all fall prey to some of them. Because we all categorize our experiences using schema. No coders listening, not a database structure. A schema describes patterns of thinking and behavior that people use to interpret the world. Matt Johnson, our guest, will talk more about schema later, so let's move on to the other type of heuristics. Anchoring and adjustment heuristics refer to decisions based on a subjective anchoring point that influences all subsequent thinking on a topic. Don't worry, I'll give examples. If you're a fan of shopping sales, you're using an anchoring heuristic. It just feels better to buy something for $10 if it's 50% off than buying something that's regularly $10, even if it's the exact same item. We get a perception of double the value when it's half off. We love deals. People love deals, and we tend not to slow brain a decision when that big 75% off banner is staring us in the face. There are other type of heuristics, and they change based on who's setting the schema. Things like the affect heuristic, that's making decisions based on gut feelings rather than logic. The affect heuristic is why we're advised not to make any decisions when we're very upset. When you're in crisis, don't make permanent choices because of the affect heuristic. The absurdity heuristic, classifying things that are improbable as absurd rather than giving them proper consideration. This will lead doctors to missing a diagnosis of a rare disease, just as for instance, of the absurdity heuristic. The contagion heuristic is seeing people, ideas, and things as being either positively or negatively contagious despite a lack of logic there. Meaning this is not a viral disease. It's the idea that somebody's luck will rub off on you, for instance, or the idea that high schoolers learning about the existence of trans people will turn your teen trans. No, that's a contagion heuristic. It doesn't work that way. If you're connecting these heuristics to your logical fallacy checklist, critical thinking buffs, you're correct. Mental shorthands make our day-to-day decisions easier and faster. Again, we all do them. But when it comes to deep thinking, judgments of complex people, and determining whether someone is telling the truth or lying, those mental shorthands often lead us astray. One of the ways they do that, and sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not, is sorting things into the familiar and unfamiliar, lumping things into an existing schema or splitting them into a new one. Matt Johnson, PhD, neuroscientist, and author of Blindsight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brains, will be here to talk to us after the break. Questions, comments, concerns, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. Join the mailing list while you're fill out the contact form, or at Not Therapy Show on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. We will be right back talking heuristics, no, I didn't sneeze, how we make quick decisions on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking heuristics, how we make decisions quickly, efficiently, decisively, and sometimes wrongly. Sometimes the existential question for our age. And I've got an expert here to let us know what to do. Matt Johnson, PhD, speaker, writer, researcher, specializing in applying psychology and neuroscience to branding. He has a PhD of cognitive psychology from Princeton University. He's the author of Blindsight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brains, and Branding That Means Business. I love having business people on It's Not Therapy. He was inducted into the Thinkers 50 radar as one of 30 business thinkers with ideas most likely to shape the future. God, Matt, does that get overwhelming? having that intro. Like, how does somebody get on a list like that? Thanks for coming on It's Not Therapy.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
Yeah. Now, you wrote an article on Psychology Today about this concept of shaping the future of new ideas. And it's the schema work can get very bogged down in terminology. So you broke it down to basics of the idea of lumping versus splitting. The Tennessee Williams concept of, there's three great cities in America. What was it? Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Chicago. Was that it? Everything else is Cleveland. I just pulled those three out of my butt. I don't remember the quote, but that's basically how it works, right? We like to separate everything into same, different. Have I got that right so far?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. So this gets to a real fundamental way in which we, as human beings, strive to make sense of the world. So we open up our eyes, and there's this dizzying array of detail, and we need to know first and foremost what is a new thing and what is a familiar thing. And when we're looking at a thing, the thing itself doesn't wave its hand and say, "Hey, I'm a new thing. Categorize me as new." The familiar thing doesn't wave its hand and say familiar, categorize me as being familiar. It's really up to us in terms of our internal machinery to categorize something as being new or as being an example of something that we have already.
And obviously, the stories we tell ourselves about new versus familiar, right? I mean, back when I was in marketing school, it was affirmational versus aspirational marketing. Be young, have fun, drink Pepsi. Aspirational, because you're worth it. Affirmational. And it was that big, you're great just the way you are. And this step away from, don't you want new? These appeal to different types of people, don't they? I mean, openness to new experiences is a core personality trait on, multiple measuring scales. So, how does someone who isn't big on new experiences split without being terrified of the idea?
So when it comes to lumping and splitting,
Hmm.
there really isn't a best way to go about it, right? So whichever sort of general heuristic we utilize, there's trade-offs, right? So if you go into the world and you do it, Tennessee Williams style, and it's like, all right, we've got three cities in America and everything else is Cleveland, that has the advantage that it's easy to that's a schema that makes sense. It's
Hmm.
easy to make sense of. Either you're in New York, San Francisco, or New Orleans, or you're not. And it's very easy. It's cognitively not very demanding. That's on the pro side. On the con side, of course, you are dismissing all of the incredible richness and granularity of, say, a Chicago or a St. Louis or a Miami or a inserts American city here. So when we categorize in these very broad brush terms, we miss out on all this beautiful, wonderful, rich, granular detail. So if we go the other way and we split everything, right? We
Hmm.
don't paint in broad brushes. We paint with really, really fine kind of like pointillism. Everything is its own distinct thing. We get that richness, we get that granularity, but that's very demanding and it's very scary, right? Because when we go to a city that we are familiar with, we feel familiar with, we have a existing schema that allows us to operate intelligently within that environment. But when we're going into something new, by definition, we don't have a schema that allows us to have these tools to know what to do in these scenarios. So there's really kind of pros and cons and trade-offs with both approaches.
And there are ways of building schema for new experiences, right? Like going into a room where you don't know anyone. I've been interviewing people for too long, 27 years. So I know what to do in novel environments. I have my thing of I'll go up to the bar and I'll see somebody with, one of the mixology cocktails and go, is that good? And I've talked to somebody, right? And they usually look at me like, yes, but it's a trick. It's something I can do that's comfortable. I can lump it into this is my first step. Then I'm in, right? What's what have you found from a marketing perspective gets people to try new things? Something as simple as a new brand of soda or a new laundry detergent, or bigger, a new investment, like the difference between somebody who will throw their money at crypto and, somebody who has my father-in-law, his entire life never used online banking. He never used a bank card. He wanted to go into the bank and get money. So what happens from a neuroscience approach to get, certain people to be less reckless crypto bros, or somebody like my late father-in-law to maybe use a bank card?
So this gets us in a really interesting conversation where we see a genuine tension in the human brain. So the human
Hmm.
brain is really torn between these two poles. On the one hand, we are attracted to new things. We have neophilia. On the other hand, we are very naturally risk averse as a species. We have neophobia, right? And so there's going to be all sorts of individual differences. We all have sort of a constitutional position on this scale between being very averse to new things, being
Hmm.
very attracted to new things. But
Hmm.
generally speaking, all of us have this tension, right? And so in marketing, one of the frameworks which has really come out as being very effective here is whatever the product is, you need to find that happy medium, right? So if you go too new, then people reject it because it's very scary. And by definition, something that is familiar and that feels as though you've been there before, that's going to be safe because you've seen it 1,000 times before. Hasn't hurt you 1,000 times, not going to hurt you 1,001 times. So familiar feels safe. If you do it too new, it feels very threatening, right? But on the other hand, if you do it on the other end of the spectrum, it feels too familiar, then it's boring. It doesn't raise our pulse. It's not going to open our wallets. It's not going to get us excited, right? So really trying to find that happy medium. And there's a great framework that we pioneered in the book called New and Safe, which is really trying to position products that are familiar in a new light and really trying to position new products in a familiar light, right? So whatever the case may be, whether it's familiar, trying to sprinkle in a bit of novelty. If it's something really, really, really new, trying to couch it in something that's familiar. So if you're trying to do something that's very, very new, try and make the consumer feel safe with it, right? So the iPhone, for example, is like the classic example. This was
Hmm.
very, very, very new, right? We never had smartphones before. But what did Steve Jobs do when he rolled it out? He says you're going to get a music player, you're going to get a internet, search
We know
device.
what that is.
Yeah, and so we know what all these things are. If we're on a desktop computer, right? It's very new. I mean, it was very new back in the 70s and 80s. But what we have folders, right? That's an analogy to a physical
Mhm.
folder. We have a desktop, which is an analogy to a physical desktop, right? So we're encountering something new. So you're using an analogy to something that is familiar and existing. So getting that kind of sweet spot right. And then, of course, as you're approaching different consumers with different demographics, different idiosyncratic positions on this scale between sort of a level of comfort between novelty and familiarity, then sort of knowing how to crank that dial.
So that's the fundamental principle behind, say, an elevator pitch or the change one thing rule in design, right? Change one thing, you're a genius. Change two things, you're a mad genius. Change three things, it's never going to work. Forget it. That's basically what you're talking about, right? It has to be a baby step out of the comfort zone, not but this big leap out of the cave where the I'm going to get eaten by a tiger part of our brain starts screaming. It really is that fundamental, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah. And even when you talked about crypto before, right? So even when we're talking about something that's very new, like crypto, a lot of the positioning around crypto was like, well, look how there's a division between church and state. Well, Bitcoin, the analogy for Bitcoin is it's the division between bank and state, right? So we're using a familiar analogy that us in the States, North America, we're familiar with this division of church and state, and you're using that in banking, right? So you're separating the government from the currency. And so
Hmm.
Bitcoin, something that's very, very new, never been done before, not a fiat currency, not tied to a government.
Hmm.
That was really the framing that at least got it off the ground.
You appealed to some sort of ethical framework, even though what it actually was very abstract.
Very abstract. I mean, nothing is more abstract than the social conventions of money, right? So if we're on a desert island and I've got $100,000 in fiat currency, and you've got a pocket knife,
Right.
who's richer, right? So the value is based on, its ability to exist within that social context and that value in that social context. So yeah, if you're taking even a level beyond that and looking at currency itself as being abstract, then that was the major challenge, I think, with crypto.
And this is a major challenge, is those abstractions, right? That seems to be the problem of our modern age. We use social media, which are abstractions. It's all, electrical impulses. None of it's real in terms of tangible, like that pocket knife, right? It's more like a series of fiats, a representation for something, a promissory note. And all of our social interactions do come down to that, doesn't it? Like, why do women wear dresses and men wear pants traditionally? I mean, we could go into the history of it, but nobody cares about that when they're looking at the sign on the bathroom door. That has
Right,
nothing
right.
to do with science. That has nothing to do with an innate characteristic. That is one of those metaphors you were talking about, it being called Windows, it being called a mouse, it being called a folder, a recycle bin, making an abstract series of functions tangible. And
Totally.
marketing is, if we used more marketing principles in mental health, I think we would do better because they work. Marketing is all about choice funneling, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And so, how, when you talk about it being cognitively not demanding, I think that absolutely is, especially in young people, a major selling point. I hear from a lot of people under 30, they're just overwhelmed. They have so much anxiety. And because they're learning how to use new social media apps all the time, they're learning how to study in university all the time. The thing their cognition is going, nope, too hard, is socialization. Now, we know long term this bad. And yet you talk to younger people and they're like, it's too hard. I'll just get rejected. I don't have time for this. I don't have time, energy to date. I don't have time or energy to make friends. I'm so lonely. How do we use these principles of, on the one far end lump side, people are people. We're all the same that way, right? But that's too big a category. It's a not useful lump. Then splitting, everyone's an individual. We can't get our brain around that either, right? So how do we find that new and safe when it comes to people?
Ah, it's a good question. Yeah, because you're absolutely right. So every person is their own unique snowflake. They are, their own idiosyncratic self. If we're trying to understand a human being, another person, really try to treat them at this individual level is the best way to do it, and
Mhm.
not use them as an exemplar of some category that they're supposed to represent, sort of using demographic features to then make sense of the individual. But then if we're trying to zoom out, right, and we're in policy, for example,
Mhm.
right, we can't design policy around a single individual. We have to aggregate at some level, right? And so we can aggregate by age cohorts, for example,
Mhm.
right? And then we get into a little bit of a generalization, right? So we can say, all right, Gen Z is, of course, everyone's their own unique snowflake. But when we aggregate Gen Z and we aggregate, let's say, millennials, we do see differences, for example, in terms of rates of loneliness, rates of anxiety, rates of social media usage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We do see these, mean differences in statistical terms. It doesn't mean that every single Gen Z person is more anxious than every single millennial,
That's right.
but we do see these, these categorical differences come out. And so if we're engaged in a policy discussion or engaged in trying to provide general prescriptions, then these types of aggregations, while not perfect, are going to be useful. So I would,
Mhm.
as a general heuristic, sort of start with the goal, right? Is the goal to, identify people for their own unique idiosyncratic value and unique constellation of personality traits, that of course the goal is just to understand them at an individual. If the goal is to make general prescriptions for general cohorts of people that are going to affect, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, then there has to be some degree of aggregation there. And it's about sort
Mhm.
of finding that level of granularity that's going to be most useful and most productive towards that goal.
And this is also charged now, right? With that idea of, you said the word snowflake, and I'm sure a few people needed a moment. You know what? This might be a good time to give our sponsors a moment. We're going to pause this conversation with Matt Johnson on lumping and splitting because I love the word lump. We'll be back after this on It's Not Therapy. Questions, comments, concerns, nottherapyshow.com. Fill out the contact form on our website. We'll be back with more with Matt Johnson after this. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. I'm still talking lumping and splitting with Matt Johnson, neuroscientist and author of books such as Branding That Means Business and Blindsight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brains. And we were talking a bit about the reshaping of our brains, the charge in the modern world with words like snowflake, right? And so people are, no, he didn't mean it that way. And there are so many words like that now.
Totally.
I say I woke up in the morning, someone can mishear me now. And these are linguistic lumps, aren't they? If somebody starts talking about DEI or pregnant people, we lump them into one category. Somebody starts talking about woke and facts don't care about your feels, we lump them into another category.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I honestly didn't think about that in terms of how I used the word snowflake, but
Because you don't lump people that way.
well, not to my conscious knowledge, anyways.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely interesting that you mentioned that because you're absolutely right, and especially when we are interfacing with people through, let's say, social media. You'll see some aspect of their identity, right? An identity marker, whether it's a political marker, whether it's an affiliation marker, a national marker, and you use that to make sense of the entire person, right? And all too often, especially when we're engaged through social media, that the marker of the category of identity which they belong to, Canadian, for example, is used to fill in this ambiguity that we don't understand about the person. And that can be useful in some instances, right? Because we're trying to make sense of other people and we have some understanding of what these categories are to represent. Stereotypes, have some semblance of truth. But of course, what that does is it totally dismisses all of the uniqueness of every single individual within that category, many of whom don't embody those traits that you think you understand about the general category. So as a Canadian, maybe I would assume, or maybe I mean, better be careful here. But I would assume that you like hockey and you eat poutine, right? So that would be my two sort of go-tos. That's what Americans think of Canadians, right? And you put maple syrup on everything.
Are you familiar with the great poutine debate?
I'm not
cheese
actually.
or squeaky cheese?
No. See, this is the nuances that only a Canadian would know.
But that in itself is a massive lump, right? Not a literal, yes, cheese curds are literal lumps, but there are different types of cheese. There are different types of gravy, but we all go into shredded or squeaky, right? It's that heads or tails. We love lumping people
Totally
into categories to make it seem, it narrows our number of options, right? The number of conversations that Canada, I know someone from Canada. He was in Vancouver. Do you know him? And it's like, that's a very big country. That is a 5.5-hour plane ride away. But I might, tell me his name. That kind of thing. It seems kind of silly, but at least it moved the conversation one more square on the board.
Totally.
And
yeah.
that is really what it's about, right? In marketing, it's not even make the sale. It's brand recognition, get somebody thinking about Skittles by a guy with dreads milking a giraffe where rainbows are spraying out. Right. It's just, okay, Skittles. That was the first thing I thought of because it was so weird. And that's using very, very new.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Totally.
But if somebody saw a guy milking a giraffe on the street, it would probably be kind of terrifying.
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Yeah. So how does somebody, because I find a lot of people, they do shut down. There's this real cognitive dissonance and a very extreme reactance when you try to get them out of those social lumps. And I do find with young people, the older I get, I know the chiller I am with somebody, right? Somebody starts going about some sort of thing, a tribe I am not a part of. I'll just be like, okay, tell me more. Because I'm not threatened by different people. Now, I'm a home owner. I own my own business. There's very little somebody can do to me. You know, they can't contact me at my job and get me fired. People have tried at the radio station, but it didn't work. Somebody in a more precarious position is going to be very on their guard for any of those markers of difference, any of those splits that could indicate danger. So, how do we, because this is all the stay in the cave brain screaming at us, right? The only reason we care about race or gender or education level or any of that is we feel safer. We feel like they understand the world better when we split people into categories. We've probably gone too far in our highly demographic society. I come from TV. There was a time I didn't want to hear the term 18 to 24 male ever again. Right, because it was so confined. Same with 35 to 54 women. Now that's the desirable product demographic. And so I was saying, what do women like? Well, we're 51% of the population. Can you narrow it down? But like you said, people want the cognitively not demanding answers. They want that benefit, but then they want a large friend group where they feel accepted and supported as well. But you cannot feel accepted without the risk of rejection. So, from a neuroscience perspective, how do you sell people taking more risk?
Yeah, it's a massive challenge. I think one kind of fundamental drive that we have as human beings is number one, of course, we are extremely risk averse, right? So we would prefer a much more familiar path that hasn't hurt us 1,000 times, not going to hurt us on the thousandth and one, thousandth and first. I don't even know how to thousandth and one time. But so we do have this risk aversion, but also beyond that, we have this incredible drive towards ambiguity aversion, right? So it's we find it very uncomfortable to be in a conversation with somebody and not feel as if we know the person,
Right.
right? And this ambiguity is very uncomfortable, especially in a social situation, right? So whether I'm right or whether I'm not, I'm doing everything I can to conjure up every theory, every abstraction, every stereotype that I have of these identity markers to make sense of this individual, right? And that's my brain's natural way of dealing with ambiguity. I could be wrong about these things, and especially if we're talking about stereotypes and demographics, et cetera, chances are I am going to be wrong about these things, but I feel better. I feel more secure in feeling as if I know the person as opposed to just basking in ambiguity.
Right.
And so one thing that I think we can do much more on an interpersonal level before we get into sort of the marketing of things is actually falling back in love with ambiguity. That it's really okay to sit across from somebody and wonder about them and be enchanted by their unique idiosyncrasies and to really resist this reflex to inject these sort of top-down categories onto the individual and to make assumptions and to make leaps and to sort of fill in this gap, to just be to let ourselves find out about the person as opposed to jumping to conclusions about them is I think a very healthy way to be in a social situation, because of course on the other side of things, we want to be appreciated as an individual, right? Everybody wants to be appreciated as an individual. Of course, we have aspects of our identity which we're proud of that is an important sliver of our sort of portfolio of interests, and we want to be recognized for that. But above all, we want to be recognized as an individual. So when people see us as individuals, both parties are gonna be feeling good about that interaction.
Hmm.
From a marketing standpoint, yeah, it's challenging, right? Because we, of course, we have demographics that are extremely risk averse. And so one way in which companies go about this is they say, all right, you're, afraid to try something new. You're afraid, you're,
Hmm.
very averse to friction. Let's remove that friction. Let's give you convenience. Let's give you products that you feel is familiar. And let's, we see you in that comfort zone, and you're still a solvent member of society. You still have economic value in your comfort zone. Let's just keep you there, right? And just keep paying that subscription, keep watching Netflix every single night,
Right.
and that's fine. And so I think there is, unfortunately, huge incentives for companies to just keep people in this comfortable zone, not break them out of things, not break them out of their subscriptions, not break them out of their comfort zone, and just keep allowing them to sort of stay where they are. That's, I think, advantageous for a lot of companies and brands. I would argue not so advantageous for the individual, because if you're not getting outside this comfort zone, if you're not experiencing, at least on occasion, the unfamiliar, which is going to require you to split and require you to have experiences that you don't have a pre-existing schema for, you're not going to grow. You're not going to undergo any sort of personal transformation. You're not going to become more resilient. You're not going to be more
Hmm.
open to different experiences, and yeah, there's just sort of a lack of personal growth there, unfortunately.
You're such a fantastic persuasive speaker, Matt. Every question you answer, you begin with empathy, you validate, and you build this bridge between where the person is and where you want them to go. And it's almost this ongoing masterclass in going from we are different to we are the same and creating that comfort. And it's been such a real um pleasure to just listen to you, because we live in a world, I'm sure people feel very comfortable by this conversation right now, because we live in a world where negative political ads, this talk radio format, trying to shock people into engaging, into getting angry, into getting so frightened or ticked off that they need to take action. And that's coercive. The way you're doing it is persuasive, because instead of scaring someone into running away or triggering the fight or flight response, you're going, it's okay. You're nudging people into that new area by doing the new and safe approach. Have I pretty much understood what your technique is for this?
I think you've got it spot on.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think just first recognizing that this is it's a fundamental way that the brain works, right?
Hmm.
So a person who finds themselves with a certain predilection towards either extreme lumping or extreme splitting or anything in between, whatever it is, it's not their fault. It's just a reflection, it's expression of the brain's fundamental drive, right? So we're fundamentally driven to understand the world. We have these variety of tools and heuristics to do that. And based on the unique constellation of our genetic endowment and the experiences that we have, we're going to find ourselves on one of these one of these constitutional positions on this spectrum. And there's trade-offs to both of them.
So basically, figure out which way you land. I know I'm very judgy. I'm a lumper. So I always go, okay, I think it's this, but maybe it could be something else. So let's not be Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff. You
Right.
know, somebody who is more of a splitter, that no, that's not like me, not like me, not like me. How do you get someone to lump more?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the first thing is sort of recognizing the trade-offs on both sides of things, right? So we
Okay.
talked about, on the lumping side, it makes life, a bit easier. We have these broad brush categories that we can tap into, but you don't have the same level of granularity. The splitter, though, to their credit, they do have that incredibly rich granularity. So every experience is a new category of experience, right? So there's a lot of studies linking this to sort of a richer compendium of memories and
Hmm.
sort of a more creative sort of approach when it comes to certain tasks. But then maybe a more of a trepidation when going to experiences, because everything sort of feels so new. Some of that, I think, can be a matter of kind of self-talk, right? So if you are encountering a new experience, of course, it's going to feel highly new because your natural predilection is towards splitting, to just give yourself that kind of pep talk and be like, hey, you've had all these experiences before. It's probably going to be, something very similar to this, and you're going to know what to do kind of in that moment. And so I think the more that there can be a sort of a positive orientation in that way, the more that the individual can sort of, move appropriately towards, more of a lumping heuristic.
So just reassure yourself it's okay to make a few assumptions as long as you identify the assumption.
Totally, totally. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is context dependent, right? Because there's a lot of lumpers, and I would consider myself a lumper in some contexts, where I wish I could experience things with the freshness and rawness of an entirely new experience. I didn't bring all of these top-down assumptions that I'm assuming is going to be the case about this experience from my pre-existing prepotent categories, right? And there's some instances where I could recognize that I have more experience in this domain, and I can bring this knowledge in, and I can make things a bit easier on myself. So I think a lot of it isn't trying to shift ourselves constitutionally, but really giving ourselves the flexibility of when to lump and then when to split.
Makes sense. Matt Johnson, PhD, speaker, writer, researcher, author of top-selling consumer psychology book, Blindsight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brain. I think I'm going to pick that one up myself. And Branding That Means Business. Both of those are fairly recent. Check him out. And Matt, you are neuroscienceof.com, correct? So like neuroscience, brain science of conjunction.com. That's how people can find you online, right?
Yep, neuroscience of. Yep.
All right. Matt, thanks so much for coming on It's Not Therapy. This was a real blast. When we come back, final thoughts. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking heuristics, lumping and splitting, just because I love the word lump and like saying it. She's lump, she's lump, she's lump. Oh, nostalgia there. Okay, so all of us lump and split. Sounds dirty, but we do it in different ways. And the ways we do it, the way we separate the familiar from the novel, changes our perspective on things. And what Matt was talking about, new and safe, that's a great concept to overcome fear of new experiences or social anxiety. For instance, the idea of going into a room full of people that you don't know can be pretty intimidating, to say the least. But if it's a familiar environment, or at least a familiar type of environment, it's easier, right? An example, whenever I lecture at a university, it's an entirely new group of students. I'm only there once a term. It can be a different class. Sometimes it can even be a different campus. But it's the same topic. I lecture on gender and agency in video game design. So I basically know what I'm in there to do. That's the familiar that allows me to function very quickly and effectively, even though it's an entirely different group of people. Setting task-based goals, like delivering a lecture on a specific topic, if groups of new people scare you, is something I personally find helpful as an introvert that gets anticipatory anxiety when I'm going into a place where, oh God, they may find me weird and annoying, right? Right. A lecture is a very structured environment, but what about something like going into a bar? If I'm at a bar, for the last one I was in on my own, not knowing anybody, was for a talk on haptics. You know, the things that make your PlayStation 5 controller vibrate? Yeah, that. So I didn't know anybody there. I was there to hear a talk, but there was mixing. So I did my go-to in a bar. I went up to the bar, checked out the signature cocktail list, looked around for somebody who seemed to be drinking, the bartender special, and I asked them if it was any good. People like volunteering opinions about things like that. It's relatively safe. It's not awkward. They're not giving you any information about themselves except, yeah, it's good or yeah, it's not. When the other person is an authority on something, they feel more comfortable. And so it's a social lubricant, even if the cocktail is non-alcoholic. See how that works? I have a plan going in. So even though the entire environment is not familiar, that first step is. Now, I'm fortunate in that I tend to move in nerd circles where people wear their hobbies on their t-shirts or their bags or their purses or their hats. So a Pokemon or Batman logo can help you know what someone is interested in so you can start a conversation. Different scenario, possibly less nerdy. If you're at a friend's party and that friend is the only person you know, asking other guests how they know that friend is a good conversation starter. And this is the stuff that some people learn by observing and mimicking while they're growing up, and other people don't get the opportunity to do. And those people that don't get that early life practice are terrified. What if someone thinks I'm creepy? I do think a lot of people toss around the creepy label too much because they can't put their finger on values vocabulary to go, he didn't take no for an answer, or just simply, honestly, he wasn't cool enough, I wasn't interested, he was hitting on me, and I didn't want to deal with it. And we'll have to have a talk again about how being kinder to people who are hitting on you might not be the worst thing in the world. But anyway, part of the whole, he's hitting on me, is that could be a novel experience for someone. That's my suspicion because, back in the day, the job I did in TV, inappropriate comments were par for the course. And so I got used to handling them. When you're not used to somebody coming up and propositioning you, that's a split, right? It's not normal as far as you're concerned. So it may seem scary and therefore creepy. But why does someone thinking you're attractive feel unsafe? And how can you make things like that feel safer, right? That's where you shift your schema. How do you shift your schema to work better for you? That's basically what this show is about. We talk about it every week, but I am out of time this week. It's too bad. I feel like we just got started. Anyway, nottherapyshow.com. Question, comments, concerns, suggestions for a future show. What kind of thinking do you need to shift? Until next time, you're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Lump.